Christmas Eve, 1899, settled over the Wyoming frontier beneath a sky filled with heavy snow clouds. The little railway depot in the town of Pine Ridge had grown quiet as the last train disappeared into the white wilderness, leaving only drifting snow, empty tracks, and the mournful whistle fading into the distance. Families embraced one another. Children laughed as they hurried home with wrapped presents, and warm lights glowed from every window along Main Street. But on a lonely wooden bench at the edge of the depot sat 23-year-old Sarah Whitmore, clutching a worn canvas bag that held everything she owned. Her thin brown dress was torn from weeks of travel. Her coat had been stolen 2 towns earlier, and her boots were so worn that icy water seeped through every step. Snowflakes settled across her shoulders and hair as she stared at the empty tracks, trying to believe the man who had promised to meet her had simply been delayed. Hours earlier she had arrived with hope, carrying a letter from the rancher who had invited her west to become his wife. Instead, the station master had quietly informed her that the rancher had died 2 weeks before in a riding accident. No one had sent word before she boarded the train. Now she was alone in a town where she knew no one, with no money for another ticket and nowhere to sleep on the coldest night of the year. As darkness deepened, the temperature dropped even further. The depot slowly emptied until only the station master remained, locking the ticket office before apologizing that he had to return home to his family for Christmas dinner. He offered Sarah a cup of hot coffee and suggested she try the boarding house, but the owner refused to take guests without payment. Sarah thanked him anyway, unwilling to reveal just how desperate she had become. Pride was all she had left. She wrapped her arms around herself and whispered a prayer that somehow morning would come before the freezing wind claimed her strength. Around her, Christmas carols drifted from distant homes, while church bells echoed softly across the snow-covered valley. Every joyful sound only reminded her that she belonged nowhere. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks, freezing almost as quickly as they fell. Several townspeople passed by, some offering sympathetic glances, others pretending not to notice. A few assumed she was simply waiting for another train. None realized she had nowhere to go. Snow continued falling, covering the bench, her bag, and the footprints around her until it seemed the storm wanted to erase every sign she had ever existed. Sarah remembered her late mother's final words. No matter how dark the night becomes, kindness always finds those who refuse to stop believing. She repeated those words again and again, though each passing minute made believing more difficult. Several miles away, wealthy ranch owner Jacob Callahan guided his powerful black horse through the snow toward town. At 34 years old, Jacob had earned respect across the Wyoming Territory for building the largest cattle ranch in the county through honesty, determination, and compassion. Christmas meant little to him since losing his younger sister to illness years earlier. Yet every Christmas Eve he visited Pine Ridge to deliver food, blankets, and gifts to struggling families. His late mother had taught him that a rancher's wealth was measured, not by acres of land but by the lives he helped along the way. After delivering the final wagon load of supplies to the church, Jacob prepared to leave when an elderly widow quietly touched his arm. "There's a young woman still sitting alone at the depot," she whispered. "I've watched her since noon. She hasn't moved." Jacob frowned. "Has no one helped her?" The widow lowered her eyes sadly. "Everyone thought someone else would." Those simple words weighed heavily on Jacob's heart. Without another question, he turned his horse toward the depot. Snow swirled around him as he rode through the silent streets, unaware that one small decision on Christmas night was about to change to lonely lives forever. Jacob Callahan tied his black horse outside the depot and stepped onto the snow-covered platform, where only one lonely figure remained. Sarah Whitmore sat motionless on the weathered wooden bench, her shoulders trembling beneath the falling snow. Her hands were wrapped tightly around a worn canvas bag, as if it were the last thing connecting her to the life she had left behind. For a long moment Jacob simply watched her, realizing that she had likely been sitting there for hours, while the entire town hurried home to warm fireplaces and Christmas celebrations. Slowly, he walked closer, removing his heavy wool coat before draping it gently across her shoulders. Startled, Sarah looked up with frightened eyes, expecting another stranger who wanted something from her. Instead, she found a cowboy whose expression held only quiet kindness. Snow rested on the brim of his black hat, and his calm voice carried a warmth that the freezing wind could not steal. "No one should spend Christmas night alone," he said softly. "Come home with me." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. Every lesson her mother had taught her warned against trusting strangers. Yet something about Jacob's steady eyes made her feel safer than she had since arriving in Wyoming. She hesitated before quietly explaining everything: the journey west, the letters from the rancher who had promised her a new beginning, the news of his death, and the realization that she had nowhere left to go. Jacob listened without interrupting. When she finished, he simply nodded. "Then your journey isn't over," he replied. "It's only taken a different road." He lifted her canvas bag, helped her onto his sturdy wagon, wrapped another warm blanket around her shoulders, and turned the horses towards Silver Creek Ranch. The journey home took nearly an hour through the snow-covered prairie. Moonlight reflected softly across endless white fields, while pine trees swayed beneath heavy snow. Sarah remained quiet, watching the peaceful landscape as Jacob occasionally pointed toward familiar landmarks: the frozen river where children skated each winter, the old church that hosted Christmas dinners, and the distant hills where wild horses roamed in spring. Little by little, the fear inside her began to fade. She realized this cowboy asked for nothing in return. He offered only kindness. When they finally reached Silver Creek Ranch, Sarah's eyes widened. The large wooden ranch house glowed with warm golden light pouring from every window. Smoke drifted lazily from the stone chimney, while evergreen wreaths and lanterns decorated the porch. Ranch hands laughed as they unloaded Christmas supplies, and several children from neighboring families played in the fresh snow. The place felt alive, filled not with wealth alone, but with generosity. Jacob introduced Sarah to Mrs. Eleanor Parker, the elderly housekeeper who had practically raised him. Without hesitation, Eleanor embraced the shivering young woman as though welcoming a long-lost daughter. Within minutes, Sarah was seated beside a roaring fireplace, holding the first truly hot meal she had eaten in days. For the first time since leaving home, Sarah smiled. Over the next several days, she insisted on helping around the ranch. She cooked alongside Eleanor, mended torn blankets, read stories to the ranch hands' children, and even helped organize supplies for struggling families living nearby. Everyone noticed how naturally she fit into the ranch. Even Jacob found himself looking forward to breakfast conversations and evening walks across the snowy fields. Yet neither spoke about what was quietly growing between them. Unknown to Sarah, trouble was approaching. In the nearby town, wealthy businessman Victor Kane had learned that the woman who had been promised to the late rancher was still alive. Hidden among the dead man's belongings was a legal document naming Sarah as the rightful heir to valuable land adjoining Silver Creek Ranch. If Sarah discovered the truth, Victor's secret plan to seize thousands of acres would collapse forever. Determined to stop her, he hired 3 ruthless gunmen to find the mysterious young woman. Before anyone uncovered the missing papers, one icy afternoon, while Sarah gathered firewood near the edge of the ranch, she noticed unfamiliar horse tracks leading toward the property. At almost the same moment, Jacob spotted 3 distant riders watching the ranch from a snowy ridge. Their dark coats and motionless horses made it clear they were not travelers passing through. Jacob's instincts told him only one thing: someone had come looking for Sarah. As the winter winds swept across the frozen prairie, neither Jacob nor Sarah realized that the peaceful Christmas miracle which had brought them together was about to be tested by danger unlike anything either had imagined. The cold Wyoming wind howled across the snow-covered prairie as Jacob Callahan stood on the porch of Silver Creek Ranch, watching 3 unfamiliar riders disappear beyond a distant ridge. Every instinct told him they would return. Inside the ranch house, Sarah Whitmore was helping Eleanor prepare supper, unaware that her peaceful new beginning had become the target of dangerous men. Jacob quietly instructed his ranch hands to remain alert through the night and sent one of his most trusted cowboys to the sheriff in Pine Ridge, whatever secret these strangers were chasing. He intended to keep Sarah safe. The following morning, just after sunrise, the riders returned. Their leader, Victor Kane, stepped from his horse with a confident smile that never reached his eyes, holding a folded legal paper. He claimed Sarah belonged on another ranch and demanded she come with him immediately. Sarah stepped onto the porch, frightened but determined. Before she could answer, Jacob calmly moved in front of her. She'd decide her own future, he said firmly. No one forces anyone to leave this ranch. Victor's smile disappeared. After exchanging cold stares with Jacob, he mounted his horse and warned that they would regret standing in his way. That evening the sheriff arrived, with 2 deputies after receiving Jacob's message. Together they began investigating Victor's claims. Eleanor suddenly remembered an old wooden chest that had belonged to the late rancher who had originally invited Sarah west. Hidden beneath faded blankets and family photographs, they discovered a sealed envelope, addressed to Sarah. With trembling hands she opened it and found not only a heartfelt letter, but also the missing legal documents proving that the neighboring property had been left in her care. The rancher had hoped she would use the land to build a home and help struggling frontier families. Victor had tried to steal that inheritance before Sarah could ever learn the truth. The next morning the sheriff confronted Victor Kane in town. Faced with the genuine documents and testimony from several witnesses, Victor's lies quickly collapsed. He and the hired gunman were arrested for fraud, intimidation, and attempted theft. As the jail wagon carried them away, the people of Pine Ridge finally understood what Sarah had endured. Many who had unknowingly walked past her on that lonely Christmas night came forward to apologize. Sarah accepted every apology with grace, knowing bitterness would only keep her trapped in the past. Winter slowly gave way to spring. Snow melted across the valleys, rivers flowed once more, and green grass covered the prairie around Silver Creek Ranch. Instead of selling the inherited land, Sarah fulfilled the late rancher's dream. Together with Jacob, she helped build a small schoolhouse, repaired homes for struggling widows, and opened a community kitchen where no traveler would ever be turned away hungry or alone. The ranch became known throughout Wyoming as a place where kindness always found a home. One warm spring evening, Jacob led Sarah to the hill overlooking the ranch. The sunset painted the mountains with golden light as cattle grazed peacefully below. Reaching into his pocket, he removed a simple gold ring that had belonged to his mother. Looking into Sarah's eyes, he smiled and said, "The night I found you at the depot, I thought I was rescuing a stranger. I never imagined God was bringing the greatest blessing into my life. Sarah Whitmore, will you stay here, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because this is where your heart belongs?" Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she whispered the answer he had hoped to hear. Yes. Several weeks later, the little frontier church overflowed with family, friends, ranch hands, and townspeople. The same community that had once watched Sarah sit alone at the depot now celebrated her joyful wedding to Jacob Callahan. Laughter echoed through the valley as church bells rang across the prairie. Children scattered wildflowers along the path, while music and dancing continued late into the evening. Years later, travelers passing through Pine Ridge often heard the story of the lonely young woman left to freeze at the depot on Christmas night, and the cowboy who simply whispered, "Come home with me." They said it wasn't wealth or courage that made Jacob Callahan a great man. It was one small act of kindness offered to a stranger when everyone else had walked away. And Sarah never forgot that miracles often arrive quietly, disguised as ordinary compassion. Thank you for watching. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe for more emotional Old West cowboy stories, inspiring frontier adventures, and unforgettable romances every week.